Welcome everybody to the Wilmette Institute's second web talk for 2017. Today we're going to hear from Gregory Dahl about globalization and current events in Baha'i perspective, and I think you would agree that this is a very, very timely topic and one that I think everyone will very much enjoy hearing about. But first, let me give you a quick rundown about the Wilmette Institute itself in case you aren't familiar with it. We've been around since January of 1995, which means we're actually 22 years old. For our first 10 years, we ran a face-to-face program called the Spiritual Foundations for a Global Civilization, and it included a web component, online component. We then started online courses in 1998, and since then, as of this very date, we've had 398 courses and 10,823 learners. So we're pushing up towards our 400 course mark and the 11,000 learner mark. We just added the Ukraine as a country from which we've had a participant, so we're now at 119 countries. And our learners, and for that matter, even our faculty, as a result of the involvement in our courses, have been able to use the materials to give countless presentations to classes and study circles, other kinds of meetings. We've had even people gain the confidence to speak on the radio who didn't have that confidence. Of course, we're now also doing web talks, webinars. We've started web publications, and we're hoping now to start courses for credit in this year because we're working on an articulation agreement with a particular institution of higher education who will allow people to take our courses and get credit, assuming we'll be able to finalize that arrangement, of course, which seems pretty likely. Today, we have Gregory Dahl speaking, and he is, of course, been at the International Monetary Fund for 27 years. He was working there as a senior official and as an economist. He's been their resident representative in Haiti, Sierra Leone, Bulgaria, and Madagascar. In these various places, of course, he's had considerable experience about how economies work, how poverty alleviation can be improved, how wealth distribution, corruption can be issues. So he's really an ideal person to speak about the subject of globalization. He's also served on the National Spiritual Assembly of Bulgaria and has been a Hukukullah representative as well in Europe. Today, as I said, his topic is going to be globalization and current events. So now, Greg, we will turn it over to you, and we'll be very happy to hear your presentation.
So thank you, Rob. I guess I'm on here. And hello, everybody. The title for this talk was chosen some months ago, and in the meanwhile, I think current events have gotten quite interesting. So I want to start by talking about how Baha'is might be viewing what's happening in the world. And then towards the end, I'll have a few thoughts to share about globalization in the context of the themes that we will have discussed. I feel that many people in the world now are worried by what's happening in the world. There was a poll taken of Americans recently in which more than half said they felt discouraged. Maybe some Baha'is especially feel discouraged because the world seems to be moving in a very different direction than what we confidently have expected to see. Certainly there are many serious dangers facing the world that aren't being properly addressed, and there's a lot to worry about. I think the former U.S. Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, in a recent very high-level meeting handing over to the new administration in America, I think she summarized the situation very succinctly. She said, "The world is a mess." It's not really that things are so bad yet. We're certainly not where we were during the world wars of the 20th century, but there's a sense somehow that things are going in the wrong direction. And that is troubling people, especially after so many years in the second half of the 20th century, when we thought that we had left behind the horrors of war and were moving gradually in the right direction. I also have a sense, as my personal feeling from the recent messages of the House of Justice, that there's an increased tone of urgency in their messages. That maybe things will be moving even more quickly in the direction of crises and problems in the world. Of course, as Baha'is, we shouldn't be surprised by any of this. We have from Baha'u'llah this very clear language. He says, the signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appeareth to be lamentably defective. Very strong language. And a very interesting phrase that the Guardian used in his World Order messages, he referred to the House of Justice, said, posterity will regard the House of Justice as the last refuge of a tottering civilization. Again, very strong language. We have from Baha'u'llah the image that there's a dual process. He says, soon will the present-day order be rolled up and a new one spread out in its stead. And, of course, the Guardian developed this theme at length. He wrote about the universal fermentation, which he said would purge and reshape humanity in anticipation of the day when the wholeness of the human race will have been recognized and its unity established. And he goes on in the same passage to talk about this twofold process, the constructive process, building the new world order, and destructive forces. So we have this very clear image in the Baha'i writings of two processes, the old world order disintegrating and the new one being built up. And we are very privileged to be part of that building process rather than the destructive process. There's another concept in the Baha'i writings. We have to move quickly here because we have a lot to cover. There's another concept which is very useful that Abdu'l-Baha used and Shoghi Effendi repeated, and that is the speaking about the progress of an individual going through stages of childhood, youth, or adolescence and maturity, and the same process being one that humanity has to go through, and that we are now in or leaving the period of adolescence, which is a turbulent and difficult period, and entering the phase of maturity. Recently in their 2015 Rizwan message, the House of Justice summarized, I think very succinctly, the current situation, saying the social consensus around ideals that have traditionally united and bound together a people is increasingly worn and spent. And they refer to self-serving, intolerant, and toxic ideologies that feed upon discontent and resentment. And they went on to analyze the situation and say the moral force which sustains society has become gravely depleted. So we have this image of a disintegrating old order, and we are building a new order. And the question is, what does that new order consist of? Rahil Khanum made a comment once that I found very interesting. I want to share with you. She said that at the time of Baha'u'llah, the most practical person in the world was Baha'u'llah himself. She said, how could he give us a world order designed by Almighty God to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth and change the whole aspect of the planet if he weren't the most practical man in the world? And she went on to talk about also how practical the Guardian was. So the Baha'u'llah gave us many teachings which are the building blocks, if you like, of the new world order. So let's go beyond generalities and look exactly on what some of those building blocks or elements of the New World Order might be. In his Association for Baha'i Studies talk last summer, the former member of the House of Justice, Farzam Arbab, suggested that in every field where Baha'is are working, we should try to identify those elements of the current knowledge and practice in the world that are useful for the building of a new world order, and those that are not useful and that we would want to distance ourselves from. So how do we do that? The House of Justice, in their message of the promise of world peace, said the primary challenge in dealing with issues of peace is to raise the context to the level of principle, as distinct from pure pragmatism. There are spiritual principles, or what some call human values, by which solutions can be found to every social problem. So the point is to think about, to understand, and then to act on principle. And that is, in fact, the first principle that we have, is to act on principle. Now, I want to identify some of the principles that come to my mind in the Baha'i teachings when I look at the world around us, and explore how those principles apply to the way we should view what's happening in the world. But before I get to that, I want to comment some on the way we should approach these issues, our attitude or our methodology, if you like. I like this drawing, which is actually two drawings in one. There's an old lady with a crooked nose, and there's a young woman with a hat. Those of you who have seen this drawing can see both images. Those who may not have seen it may be seeing only one, and you may have actually great difficulty seeing the other until suddenly you see it. Now, this illustrates, I think, a very important point about how human minds work. We have an amazing ability as human beings to see patterns. In fact, in the case of faces, we see them when we're first born. We're fascinated by them. But we have a very sophisticated ability as human beings to simplify the chaos in the world around us by applying our experience and what we have learned and seeing patterns in the world around us. And this is a very important and very positive feature of the capabilities that we all have as human beings. But a lot of what we use in analyzing our surroundings is things that we have learned. Eloy Anello called them mental frameworks. The House of Justice has referred to habits of thought and a mindset. So we approach the world around us with a certain perspective, if you like. And therefore we tend to see what we expect to see or what we want to see. In the case of this painting or this picture, the brain is very well attuned to seeing faces. In fact, we can see faces even in very sketchy cartoons. And so our brain focuses immediately on the image that it expects to see. And for me, what's interesting to me about this drawing is that, at least for my mind, it's hard for me to see both faces at the same time. I don't know about you, but my brain switches between the two pictures, and I either see one or the other, and I can choose which one. So you can see from this picture, which is a reality, if you like, that there are two very distinct ways of looking at that reality, and it's useless to argue with someone about whether it's a picture of an old lady or a young woman, because both are true, and the reality is that it is both. So this illustrates how many things can be seen from different points of view, and both may be perfectly valid, and just different ways of looking at the same facts or the same reality. I'll give you another example. Recently I was amused by two parallel news reports from reputable sources on the same facts, which was an election in Berlin last fall. And Bloomberg said old parties diminished, and the Financial Times says populists missed target, voters rallied to the mainstream parties. So you have two news sources with opposite slant to the headlines. One, of course, was in relation to expectations and not the other one, but both perfectly valid. I'd like to give another example at the risk of boring you a little bit from my field, which is economics. It is often stated and assumed that higher house prices are good. The idea is that when house prices are higher, people feel wealthier, they maybe spend more. This reflects positive attitudes towards the economy, and all of that is very good. Now, let's examine that, which I think is almost universally the way this kind of news is presented. In fact, the value of my house may have gone up, but and I know that because of some numbers I've read somewhere, but I'm living in the same house, so I'm not actually any wealthier than I was before in any real sense. And if I decide to sell this house and buy another one, but that house price has also gone up, then again, I am in the same position I was before. Nothing has changed for me, and I'm certainly not wealthier. The only time when I'm actually wealthier is when I sell my house and buy something smaller or live in a rental place. In other words, I'm downsizing. Now, the question is, whenever there's a seller, there's also a buyer. Whenever there's a buyer, there's also a seller. So there are two sides of this story. And so I may be downsizing as an older person and leave that transaction with extra money, but there's a buyer on the other side who more than likely is a younger person entering the housing market who has to pay a higher price. And for him, it's clearly bad. In other words, whatever is my advantage as a seller is his disadvantage as a buyer. And it's certainly not clear from a social point of view that higher house prices, if they are resulting in transfers from the from the younger to the more elderly, that's a good social policy. In fact, one might consider that a bad development. So the same facts can be seen from different points of view. And I suspect that the people who write about economics tend to be people who own houses and are seeing it from that perspective. So the conclusion of all of this discussion is that we should be approaching issues in the world with a degree of humility and a posture of learning, and be open to the views of others and understanding that reality may be multifaceted. Now there's another aspect of this question that I want to touch on, which is the importance of avoiding false dichotomies and oversimplification. The House of Justice, in a message, wrote that we should. This was to the Continental Conference, the Conference of Continental Councillors, that it's important to avoid false dichotomies. It is essential that ideas forming part of a cohesive whole not be held in opposition to one another. And very interestingly, in the more recent message, they referred to apparent dichotomies yield to unexpected insights. So we know that around us, many people see everything in terms of dichotomies, and it's very clear that Baha'is should avoid being drawn in to this way of looking at things. In other words, drawn into the way the world frames problems in terms of political parties, red or blue, left versus right, liberal versus conservative, us versus them, educated versus uneducated, and so forth. There are many politicians, I'm afraid, who take advantage of this way of thinking to plant attitudes of distrust and fear, whereas before there was acceptance and friendship. And it's very dangerous, and in fact I'm quite interested in how easily people fall into this. It's very dangerous to allow ourselves to be drawn into that way of looking at things. Some of us thought that that had been left behind with Hitler in the Second World War, but it's obviously very alive still in the world. Now I want to move on to this selection of a few principles that have come to my mind when looking at what's happening in the world, principles from the Baha'i teachings. This is certainly not an exhaustive list or in any particular order. It's just a very personal one, but perspectives that I found useful. The first, against the background of this discussion, is the principle of consultation. Actually, the House of Justice has referred to it as the law of consultation, which they say is indispensable for the ordering of human affairs. It is, of course, a way of combining different perspectives into one perception of truth so that we can all benefit from each other's perspectives and experience. In a paper prepared for the House of Justice, approved by them, there's a passage on consultation. They refer to consultation may be seen as collective search for truth. And of course, there's a whole compilation on the subject of consultation. It's a central principle for Baha'i administration, which we know is the pattern for the world order. It's a very big subject. The next principle, which is a very central principle in the Baha'i faith, is the principle of unity, or inclusiveness, or overcoming prejudices. We see, again, in the world around us, a lot of scapegoating, a fear of immigrants and those who are different. Politicians, as I was just saying, can play on those fears and encourage polarized thinking. This is a good example of false dichotomies, by the way, because, in fact, people have multiple identities and many communities all simultaneously, but the whole question gets simplified in people's minds. So we have in the Baha'i writings this very, very central principle of the unity of mankind. Baha'u'llah wrote, "Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. So powerful is the light of unity that it can illuminate the whole earth." These are statements that we're all familiar with, but they're very profound. In fact, people have given whole talks on the image of being leaves of one tree, because it's a very powerful image from nature. Shoghi Effendi summarizes the main teachings of the Baha'i faith as presented by Abdul Baha in his talks in the West, and he mentions the oneness of the entire human race, the pivotal principle and fundamental doctrine of the faith. And he also mentions in the same list the condemnation of all forms of prejudice. Baha'u'llah wrote, "The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established." And importantly, Abdu'l-Baha wrote in The Secret of Divine Civilization, "Nothing can be effected in the world, not even conceivably, without unity and agreement. And the perfect means for engendering fellowship and union is true religion." So unity and agreement is essential for doing anything in the world, and the only, or the perfect means, he says here, way of achieving it is through true religion. And again, Abdu'l-Baha in the Promulgation of Universal Peace, his talks in America, he says, "Universal peace is an impossibility through human and material agencies. It must be through spiritual power. There is need of a universal impelling force which will establish the oneness of humanity and destroy the foundations of war and strife. None other than the divine power can do this." Very vivid images of the need for a power which is strong enough to chase away the divisive forces in the world. So the next subject that I would like to mention is again, a very central issue that has arisen in the world, and that's the question of truthfulness and trustworthiness. There's been, every year actually, a plunge in the feelings of trust among the public towards leaders and elites in the Western world, at least. This whole question of trust became a very central one of conversation during the financial crisis, because banks were not even trusting each other, and banks are based on trust. In Europe, the central bank had to take loans from the banks and re-lend the money to other banks because they weren't willing to lend to each other. And recently, there's been a rise of what people are calling post-truth politics. In fact, the Oxford dictionaries chose post-truth as their word of the year for 2016. And I couldn't resist putting this cover of The Economist in this presentation when they devoted a whole issue to the art of the lie, or post-truth politics. This is a major issue in the world. And of course, we have the Baha'i principle here that truthfulness and trustworthiness, quote Abdu'l-Baha, is the bedrock of his faith and the foundation of all virtues and perfections. In other words, absolutely central. Shoghi Effendi, in quoting Baha'u'llah, quotes Baha'u'llah said, "Truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues. Without truthfulness, progress and success in all the worlds of God are impossible for any soul. When this holy attribute is established in man, all the divine qualities will also be acquired." So, truthfulness, trustworthiness is essential for all other qualities. And we certainly see in the world much of the opposite happening around us. Now, the next principle I wanted to mention, because it's closely linked to truthfulness and trustworthiness, is the question of honesty and moral rectitude, what some people might call acting on principle, as opposed to expediency or self-interest, or what people are currently called transactional behavior. I recently saw a political cartoon that showed a leading politician dropping a moral compass into the garbage can. So this is a topic of current conversation, and people are thinking about it. So we have from the Universal House of Justice, they're quoting here, a sense of moral rectitude should stand in clear contrast to the, quote, demoralizing influences which a corruption-ridden political life so strikingly manifests. The Guardian called for an abiding sense of undeviating justice in a strangely disordered world. Sound familiar? And this very short sentence of Baha'u'llah, which I keep thinking of as I see what's happening in the world. When will this world-afflicting craftiness be transformed into sincerity? That's a very good description of how the courts of the Shahs of Iran were functioning in the time of Baha'u'llah, actually probably all the courts in the world. And unfortunately, we see a lot of that kind of behavior still in the world today. Now, the next general principle I wanted to mention is the importance of a positive attitude in a world where there's a great deal of negativity and people being very nasty to each other, tearing down rather than wanting to build. Well, much easier to tear down than to build, of course. Then we have in the Baha'i teachings quite the opposite. Abdu'l-Baha, in his tablets, he wrote, where there is no light, there will be darkness. When there is no sight, there will be blindness. When there is no life, there will be death. When there is no riches, there will be poverty. When there is no knowledge, there will be ignorance. In other words, the way we can approach the negative things in the world is by being positive. It's a very important principle. Abdu'l-Baha is using lots of analogies here to emphasize it, that the way we cope with the negative is to be positive, to bring a positive spirit into an atmosphere of negativity. And this lovely sentence of Abdu'l-Baha's, again from the tablets of Abdu'l-Baha, he says, keep yourselves entirely clear of the world's conditions of gloom. And this passage of Abdu'l-Baha, again from the selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, beware lest ye harm any soul or make any heart to sorrow. Beware, beware, lest you offend the feelings of another, even though he be an evildoer and he wish you ill. Gaze ye not down upon the dust, gaze upward at the shining sun. So he's talking here specifically, not just in general terms, about having a positive attitude, but having a positive attitude towards other human beings, and being aware of their feelings and looking at the good in them. Now, another central principle in the Baha'i teachings, we have lots of central principles, is the principle of moderation in a society which is tending to extremes in many parts of the world. This is a really, I think, important principle to keep in mind. Baha'u'llah wrote in Gleanings, the civilization so often vaunted by the learned exponents of arts and sciences will, if allowed to overleap the bounds of moderation, bring great evil upon men. If carried to excess, civilization will prove as prolific a source of evil as it had been of goodness when kept within the restraints of moderation. All other things are subject to this same principle of moderation. Well, these are all very profound subjects. We don't have time to go into them in depth. Another one that is very important and is very much on people's minds these days is the question of equality. A lot of people feel that some of the political events that we see in the world are a reaction to rising economic inequality, and that has produced a lot of tension and unhappiness. When the French economist Thomas Piketty published his 700-page academic book on inequality, it sold over 1.5 million copies, which certainly surprised his publisher and him, but it showed that there was enormous interest in this subject. For the recent Davos conference, the World Economic Forum, the Oxfam produced a press release in which they said that 8 men in the world have the same wealth as the 3.6 billion half of humanity that are the poorest half of humanity. In other words, 8 people own the same wealth as half of humanity. One can question their methodology, but the level of inequality clearly is far beyond anything that one could have imagined, and that is reasonable economic inequality. So this clearly is a major problem in the world. However, I don't think Piketty's solution, which is a purely economic one, applying taxes, is nearly addressing the nature of the problem, which is much more profound than simply an economic issue. There are many relevant Baha'i teachings, I think, that would, once applied, would help to reduce inequality, such as the elimination of all prejudices, the oneness of mankind, as we've discussed, universal education, the equality of men and women, a future world commonwealth, the law of hukukullah, the importance of service to others, the principle of consultation, which we've discussed, the prohibition of gambling, and many others. So as you can see, this is a very big subject and a very important one for the world. Another one that many people don't think about, but I find very interesting as an economist, is the law in the Akdas, that everyone should work. One of the issues in the political arena is the loss of jobs in many countries. And in fact, I would say as an economist that the great failing of the Western or capitalist system, whatever you want to call it, is that work and jobs are not a central policy lever, if you like. They are the result of other policies, and nobody actually is very sure how the job situation will evolve given other policies. So it's a very major issue in the way the world is organized. And the footnote in the Akdas, which I recommend to you, explains that this law of Baha'u'llah's is not just the responsibility of individuals, but also of society. So a great deal of work is needed to think about how the whole economic system can be reorganized so that people are given every opportunity to be included in the life of society, which is important for their spiritual well-being as well as for the well-being of society and the sense of unity, and as well as prosperity. Now, again, not in any particular order, but another very central principle of the Baha'i faith is the importance of service and generosity and overcoming your ego in an era where there seems to be an increasing emphasis on selfishness and a zero-sum view of society. I want to improve my lot, and I know it's going to be at the expense of your situation. The Baha'i faith is very squarely looking in a completely different direction. Baha'u'llah says, "That one indeed is a man who today dedicated himself to the service of the entire human race." Now, this is, I find, a very interesting passage from Abdul Baha, which Rahil Khanam once mentioned to me, and I was afraid to repeat it until it came out in this authorized translation from the writings of Abdul Baha. He wrote, "The souls of men are either deadly poison or useless weeds." Strong language. But he goes on to say, except for a few, but he goes on to say, "But in this matter, that is the serving of humankind, lay down your very lives, and as ye yield yourselves, rejoice." So Abdu'l-Baha is describing in very vivid language how awful the people of the world might be, but, except for a few who are trying to work for the well-being of their fellow men, but nevertheless, we are called to service of our fellow human beings which we are told in the Baha'i teachings is a form of prayer. And moving right along, another central principle of our faith, again very relevant to what's happening in the world, is that the earth is but one country. Baha'u'llah wrote, "It is not for him to pride himself who loveth his own country, but rather for him who loveth the whole world. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens." I don't need to expound on how the rising nationalism in the world is a rather different point of view. Now coming to the more specific, as I'm sure most of you know, in the Baha'i teachings we are told not to engage in partisan politics because that entails taking sides in all these ways that we've been discussing, seeing the world as dichotomous. It would pit Baha'is against other Baha'is, and that would be contrary to our basic principles. Shoghi Effendi wrote in a letter, "We must, through his secretary, we must build up our Baha'i system and leave the faulty systems of the world to go their own way. We cannot change them through becoming involved in them. On the contrary, they will destroy us." Very important advice in this difficult time when everybody seems to be getting so involved in partisan politics. And another, I think, important point for those who come from countries which pride themselves on having the best political system in the world, Shoghi Effendi was very clear in this passage that the Baha'i system is not like any other political system, whether it be democracy or anything else. It is new and unique. Yet another central principle of the faith is the principle of cooperation and reciprocity, which was very much emphasized by Abdu'l-Baha. This wonderful statement of his, "Man cannot live singly and alone. He is in need of continuous cooperation and mutual help." So this, of course, is in direct contrast with the basis of the philosophy of much Western civilization, which at least currently emphasizes competition. And Abdu'l-Baha quoted in the compilation on Hugugullah, he makes this very, very interesting statement. "Cooperation and reciprocity are manifestations of the interconnectedness that governs the universe." Not just human interactions, but the entire universe is based on this principle. And now, finally, another which I find very interesting principle and teaching in the Baha'i faith is administering with love. The Baha'u'llah wrote, and it's quoted in the Trustworthiness compilation, that we must live together in concord and harmony. He said, "Perchance the power of utterance may prevail over the power of arms, and the world's affairs be administered through the potency of love." There is a letter written by Shoghi Effendi in which he says through his secretary that administrative efficiency and order should always be accompanied by an equal degree of love, of devotion, and of spiritual development. So in the Baha'i administration, we need to consciously use the power of love, devotion, and spiritual development as we administer affairs. So governance, in other words, should be characterized by love. Now, as I said, this is just a kind of random list of principles that occur to me as I look at what's happening around the world and that I find useful, not in any particular order. But when you look at all of this, one could feel even more discouraged that things are quite clearly, I think, moving in what Baha'is would think of as a very different direction from what we are working towards and what we are expecting to see in the world. So, and we have to keep our principles very clearly in mind. I think it's useful to have them enumerated like this and keep them in mind as we see what's happening in the world around us. But this leads me to a final principle, which I think is probably the most important for this discussion, and that is the principle of learning from tests. God doesn't need to know our faults as individuals, but we need to know them. So we have in the Baha'i teachings the importance of tests for the individual. Those who blame others for their tests aren't growing because they're not becoming aware of how they need to strengthen themselves. Something which is a test for me may not be a test for you, and vice versa. You wouldn't even call it a test because it's something that's easy for you. So by definition, a test is something that you have difficulty with, which means that you have to learn what it is that you should strengthen, and then you can move on, and of course you'll get another test and strengthen something else. And that's the process of growth. So I think it's intrinsic in the process of growth that we have tests. Of course, the passages in the Baha'i writings are very strong on this subject. Baha'u'llah wrote in the hidden words, "My calamity is my providence. Outwardly it is fire and vengeance, but inwardly it is light and mercy." Abdu'l-Baha in Paris Talks, he said, "The mind and spirit of man advance when he is tried by suffering." And he wrote in selections from the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, "These tests, even as thou didst write, do but cleanse the spotting of self from off the mirror of the heart." Well, there are many such passages. Now, as we mentioned before, Abdu'l-Baha had used the analogy of the human development to describe what humanity has to go through. And Shoghi Effendi has developed that theme at length in his writings. He wrote very interesting analysis in one of his World Order letters in 1931. He said that the fire of a civil war in the United States had welded the states into a nation. Very strong language. And nothing else but that fire of the Civil War, he said, would have been able to do that. And in The Promised Day Has Come, which was written in 1941, in the midst of the Second World War, he referred to flames which would cleanse and fuse the warring elements of the world. A disciplinary and creative process whose aim is the salvation through unification of the entire planet. Mysteriously, slowly, and resistlessly, God accomplishes his design. God's purpose is none other than to usher in ways he alone can bring about, and the full significance of which he alone can fathom, the golden age of a long divided, a long afflicted humanity. Now, in case you think that the Guardian was referring to the Second World War, and that description was fulfilled, if you like, during the Second World War, he wrote again in the Citadel of Faith in 1947 to the American Baha'is in particular. And he wrote, "Tribulations on a scale unprecedented in its history and calculated to purge its institutions, to purify the hearts of its people, to fuse its constituent elements, and to weld it into one entity with its sister nations in both hemispheres, are inevitable." You notice that he used the word weld earlier in referring to the Civil War. When you weld, it's of course a process that involves extreme heat and sparks and a light that's so bright you have to wear protective goggles. It's a very dramatic process, but it results in two pieces of metal becoming one. And he uses exactly this image here to describe the process that he said America in particular would have to go through to be joined with sister nations of the world. Now, the House of Justice has referred to, this is referred to the process in the Baha'i community, but I think it's a general principle that progress is achieved through the dialectic of crisis and victory, and setbacks are inevitable. So, this again is a very dramatic, I think, expression of this very important principle that humanity has to go through a learning process the way individuals do, and it may involve very serious tests. They're only tests because we haven't learned something we need to learn, and as a result of those tests, humanity learns and makes progress. So that's the list of principles in the Baha'i teachings that I wanted to mention. And the PowerPoint will be available to you afterwards if you want to study these passages in more detail. I want to take the last few minutes to just mention briefly about globalization as an example of the application of these principles. Globalization is in fact a very complex and multifaceted phenomenon. The word itself is not well defined, and it's used very loosely, and you may find people arguing using the word, but they're meaning very different things. So that's an example of how we have to be very open to seeing reality from many points of view. It's an example also of how people like to scapegoat and oversimplify and paint things in terms of opposites, which are not necessarily opposites. For example, it is often stated that as kind of conventional wisdom that globalization and free trade have produced greater inequality and have caused people to lose their jobs and so forth. That's true to some extent, but it's not a very good description of the reality because there are many other factors at work, such as technological change, tax and other policies that favor the rich, which has always been the case, and many other aspects of the situation. Even technical progress itself, even people who've written books on the subject of globalization, very often say blithely that technical progress has led to globalization. That is a description, it is not an explanation, because the question is, why has this particular technical progress been implemented and not other inventions? There are Lord knows how many inventions in the world, and only some of them become successful and are widely adopted. Some of the richest corporations in the world are those that own patents for communications technologies, which have advanced, as we all know, very rapidly. And it's not because those companies had the technology that they have had such great success. It is because people want that technology, people are willing to pay for it, and it has spawned a whole industry responding to that demand, that need. This is a principle in economics which is known as revealed preference. You see what people want by what they choose and what they are willing to pay for. So this, in fact, I think is a really important point from a Baha'i point of view, that we have a lot of progress in the world in terms of the world becoming more aware of people in all different parts of the world, becoming more interconnected, and this is something that is not being pushed on people, it's something they want. You see a lot of interest on the part of human beings in the stories of their fellow men. I found it astonishing that a YouTube video about the atrocities in Uganda received more than 100 million views, whereas just a few years ago Uganda would have been completely off the map and nobody would have cared. And we see in many other ways this principle that people, or this desire on the part of people to experience different things, to feel connected with different cultures. You see in cities all around the world that all kinds of so-called ethnic restaurants have sprung up that didn't exist before. They're not being imposed by any multinationals. They're mostly mom-and-pop operations. They're responding to a desire on the part of the public to experience something different. People like to take vacations in exotic places. Many movies are on these themes, are filmed in different parts of the world, and we like that. Here in the Czech Republic, I drive a Škoda, which is a very good Czech car. I take my kids to school in the morning in a gray Škoda. There's a Czech father who drives a red Jeep, an American car, to the school. I want to fit in and he wants to stand out. Okay, we like having those choices. So you get cars being shipped around the world in both directions because people want that kind of choice. I could go on on this theme. I think when you start thinking about it, you'll see lots of examples of it. And I feel confident that as people make an effort to roll back these aspects of globalization, whether it be in Europe or America or other parts of the world, they'll discover that there are some things that they liked and they were enjoying about the process of globalization and the mixing of populations that they will then miss. And that may be part of the learning process that we have to go through. There's also another aspect of this whole learning process, which is the establishment of global institutions, which have mostly come about as a result of crises in the world and an attempt to avoid those crises happening again. That's a subject that I develop at some length in my book on globalization, so you can look at that if you're interested. And I think there are many other examples of how crises produce a reaction. In fact, it's a commonplace statement now, especially in Europe, that you have to have a crisis before politicians can do anything. They talk about good crises. So people recognize that a crisis is necessary somehow to produce a reaction among the public, which then can be the basis for politicians to take actions that they felt they couldn't take without that support. So the main point I want to make is that something as complicated as globalization, we have to parse it, we have to understand many elements, we have to look at it from many different points of view, and as Dr. Arbab recommended, look at those things in those processes or in what's happening in the world that are useful and positive and that can be used in the New World Order, and those that are not. Now I want to end with this wonderful statement from the Rizwan message of the Universal House of Justice of last year. How striking that amid the cacophony of fixed opinions and opposing interests that grows everywhere more fierce, you are focused on drawing people together to build communities that are havens of unity. Far from disheartening you, let the world's prejudices and hostilities be reminders of how urgently souls all around you need the healing balm that you alone can present to them. So we have to pour our energies into the core activities in the community building process, which will create a functioning example of the application of the Baha'i principles. And that functioning example already is far more compelling and convincing to people than any intellectual arguments. And this wonderful passage from Shoghi Effendi, ours is the duty to ponder these things in our heart, to strive to widen our vision and to deepen our comprehension of this cause, and to arise resolutely and unreservedly to play our part, however small, in this greatest drama of the world's spiritual history. Well, I thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.